Good morning and welcome. I'm Peter Stanton, publisher of the Worcester Business Journal, and we're happy to have you all joining us this morning for this special webcast, COVID-19 and Beyond, a HR Handbook for the New Normal. As businesses remain nimble, but also plan their move past the pandemic and begin the re-entry back to the office, our expert panel will share their perspective on how the workplace is changing, what they are doing to prepare for those changes, and that's going to give you some clear best practices to bring home to your workplace. This session is brought to you by the support of our webcast series sponsor, Bowditch & Dewey. They've been supporting our webcast series since January of this year, and we thank them for their commitment to valuable programs like this one. Before we jump into the panel discussion, just a couple of notes for the audience. If you have a question, please type it into the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many of those questions as we can. And today's webcast is also being recorded, and a link of that recording will be sent to all of you after the event. So let's get started. Our moderator today will be Worcester Business Journal's senior staff writer, Monica Benavides, and our panel that we have joining us today are Jill Green-LeBeau. Jill is the Senior VP and Chief Human Resources Officer at Fallon Health. Welcome, Jill. Marlene Tucker is Assistant Vice Chancellor of Human Resources at UMass Medical School. Thanks for joining us, Marlene. Chelsea Vokes is an attorney at Bowditch & Dewey. Thank you, Chelsea. And Meredith Wise is the President of the Employers Association of the Northeast. Thank you, Meredith, and thank you all for participating in the forum today. Monica, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Peter, and welcome everybody. I'm hoping that we can have a fruitful discussion. I'm sure that we will. So I'm going to start with directing questions at a few of you, but as we discussed before, if any of the panelists have any thoughts about the question or the answer or the comments that were made, feel free to just jump right in and we will accommodate your interest in sharing your thoughts. So my first question is for Meredith. Meredith, what would you identify as the top 2 or 3 issues employers are facing right now with regard to reopening their offices as vaccine rates increase and the region enters what is hopefully the new normal?
Thanks, Monica. You know, it's a mixed bag for most employers. And a week ago, there would have been one answer. And today with the Delta variant, maybe a slightly different answer. But basically, I think at a high level, what people are struggling with is a misalignment where management wants everybody back in the office tomorrow, 100% of the time, 40 hours a week completely. And a lot of the employees are like, you know, we kind of like this hybrid model or being remote. So there's a disconnect and there's a misalignment there that HR is struggling with and how to align those two perspectives. I think the other is concerns from employees who are coming back into the office about who's vaccinated and who's not. If I have to sit next to you, Monica, have you been vaccinated? Do I know whether you've been vaccinated? Can I know whether you've been vaccinated? And, you know, what are the concerns then that I have about masks and social distancing if I don't know whether you've been vaccinated or not? So I think those are kind of the top things that are there for employers that they're grappling with.
Is it true then, from your perspective, I think you sort of alluded to this, that most employees who moved remote are requesting to stay remote or negotiating a hybrid option? And in that, the second part of that question being, what goes into making the decision of how and when to accommodate those requests?
You know, I think you have a little bit of a mixed bag. There are some employees that have really liked being remote and want to be remote 100% of the time. That's what they would like to do. They don't really want to come back to the office. But a lot of employees would like to be back into the office in some type of a basis. So a hybrid, maybe back into the office 2 or 3 days a week and then working from home 2 or 3 days a week. And that is, you know, kind of a mixed bag that's there. I think the challenges and the things that go into making that decision for employers, one of the first ones is culture. How do you work with that? How do you work that into your culture and make sure that the conversations that happen, the catch up, the team spirit really still stays when you've got people that are in the office and people that are out of the office? And then I think the other piece is still that alignment, where in many of our organizations where they've been manufacturing or other places where there are a lot of jobs that can't be remote or hybrid, it can set up an us-them mentality that employers are trying to deal with their workforce. And how do I explain that, Jill, your position can't be remote, but Chelsea, yeah, you can be remote all the time. So that's a real challenge for most of our members and most companies.
Did anyone else have any thoughts on anything that Meredith just said? All right, then I'm going to move on to my next question, which is for Jill. First, Jill, what was your process for assessing the models that would work best for your organization? And second, what went into making the decision of when and how your organization would evolve to remote and hybrid options?
Sure. So thank you. And thanks to the Worcester Business Journal and to the other panelists. It's great to be here this morning. So, we had an advantage at Fallon because we had engaged a firm to partner with us in terms of analyzing and assessing our workplace strategy for the future. And we did that pre-pandemic. We actually issued an RFP in 2019. And that's because we're in a large space. It needs to be updated, probably needs to be reconfigured. And we knew that the work habits of our employees were changing, and also our business was changing. We were extending to different geographies, and it didn't always make sense to set up a location. We were moving more people to home office based work. Then the pandemic hit, right? And we went full remote or close to it within our Chestnut Place offices. And I do want to differentiate between two types of groups we have here at Fallon, similar to what Meredith said, but I think our people really know why they're on site. So we do have a clinical arm of our business. And those people have been, boots on the ground within our clinical facilities, within the community from the start of the pandemic. So when I speak to this hybrid model, I'm really speaking to our office-based employees at Fallon. And there's about 900 of those that have historically been located in downtown Worcester, Mass. So we move everybody out remote in the spring of 2020, or at least most people. We did have what we call now anchors, people that need to stay on site. And so then we just made sure they were safe. That was a limited number of people. And then, after we the dust settled a little, if you want to call it that, around the pandemic, last fall in 2020, we engaged that vendor that we selected. And we did a full-blown workplace strategy project. And that included interviews, a full employee survey to really understand how and where our employees could be most successful. And that's where we learned there really is this desire to have the option to work in both environments. And so we've learned that we're going to be moving forward with about 25% of our employees, they're anchors. They're going to be, based in the office 3+ days a week. About 25% that are never going to be coming on site, or very rarely, more just for some special meetings or trainings. And then everybody in between will be in the hybrid model. And just to kind of finalize the answer, it's because also we do notice that there are benefits to being on site, as well as benefits to allowing your employees to work from home. And it's making sure that our employees, who are adults and professionals, understand that reasoning, right? Pulling people back on site, or even saying to someone you should never come back in, you have to connect that to the work that they do and the needs of your business, because they do have other opportunities, right? And they could look elsewhere for the type of model they're looking for.
I just have a follow-up to that question. How did you determine who the 25% were? Are these senior management? Are these people that need to do things physically in the office?
It's a bit of a variety. Mostly, we learned at the start of the pandemic, I think like a lot of other companies, that there are certain office-based tasks and work that still needs to be done, right? Like we still use a lot of US mail. And we weren't able to just send that to everyone's home. We're also highly regulated by the state and federal government. So there's certain information that needs to stay in these walls. So for example, our remote employees aren't able to print from home unless we put very specific process and equipment in place. So that really lent to the 25%. We also have our customer service department, while they work remotely after they're trained, they start with in-office training, and we weren't able to pivot that fully remote. So we saw early on that there were still certain types of tasks and work that brought people on site.
Got it. That makes perfect sense. I don't think that we've talked much about the security aspect of having staff on site in these conversations. My next question is for Marlene. UMass Medical School has a variety of scenarios across all its divisions and programs. Some of its divisions transition to a fully remote work model, while other departments in the network, in other departments, the network has struggled to recall employees who don't wish to return. I think we know that's a common issue from company to company right now. How have you navigated this variety of models, and how do you decide which departments can stay remote, and what do you do when employees don't want to come back into the office?
Well, first, let me thank you for having me today on this panel. It's interesting to listen to the others. I think we're all facing the same issues. So one thing at the medical school, we have 3 distinct business units. One of those business units is in Mattapan. It's actually a manufacturing plant for vaccines. So obviously for that business unit, they have been on site for the most part during COVID. They have to be there. They have to, it's a manufacturing plant. And they have all returned back to work. We have another large business unit called Commonwealth Medicine, which is the public consulting arm of the medical school with about 1,000 employees. The leadership of that division decided that the total remote option was working very effectively for them. So they have remained, they are going to remain as a totally remote workforce. So the challenge is at the school, which is kind of our research enterprise, our, the 3-4 different schools that we have. Some have been totally on site right along. We call those the essential employees. They have to be there from day one of COVID. But then we have about half of that workforce, who have been working either totally remote, and now we are expected to return to normal operations as of August 1st. Now, by normal operations, we mean that the students are all returning, so the students need support, right? All the positions that support our students. What we've done is we actually created a remote work committee that looked at these different work models within the school, and what is the impact to the students, the faculty, the employees, and customers as part of the return to work process. So we're really giving the department heads the option to decide whether it's return to work fully, or is it a hybrid model or remote. So we're in the process of collecting all of that information, and the expectation August 1st, which is basically on Monday, is that everyone have some kind of plan about transitioning back to work. Now, this has been in the works since like April, May timeframe, so it's not an overnight thing. And you also asked about what about those employees who refuse? We're trying to be as flexible as possible with those employees. Why are they not wanting to return? Is it a medical reason? Is it a child care issue? What is it? So we're working with those folks individually, again, on a case-by-case basis. And, we've said to some of them, especially if it's a child care issue, well, maybe by September, once the kids are back at school and, things are operating more normally, we can wait till September to have you return to the new to the hybrid model or to transition back fully. And, you know, we're also providing a lot of support to folks too through the Office of Wellbeing. One of the programs they're offering is called Returning to the Community, because I think some people are nervous about coming into the workplace. So we are, again, trying to provide support, you know, looking at things on a case-by-case basis. And, you know, we'll continue to evaluate and reevaluate as we keep moving forward.
So my next question is for Meredith as well, but again, if anyone has thoughts, please feel free to jump in. What types of best practices are you seeing as it relates to developing new policies and procedures around remote and hybrid work? So this is sort of building off of what Marlene was just saying.
Yeah, and I think, you know, one of the things that Marlene said that really rings true with everybody, and it's coming back to basics and talking to your employees. You know, I'll date myself. We in HR, we're used to kind of setting overall policies that apply to every employee in every situation. And that just doesn't work anymore. And so, you know, I think some of the things that are really happening is that effort to really talk with all of the employees. This is what we would like to see happen. This is how we'd like to see it happen. But working with employees, what's the reason why you don't want to come back to work? What's the reason why you'd like to work remotely? What's the reason why you'd like to be back in the office all the time? And how can we make that work? How can we be flexible? How can we provide the supports that you need? So I think one of those major pieces that people are looking at with best practices is just that communication with employees. The other piece of that is, if you haven't made any decisions yet, and some of our companies in the area haven't, you know, I think Fallon and the UMass Medical Center have made some definite decisions, which is great, but a lot of our members, and we hear from companies, are still kind of struggling with, what do I do? One of the things along that line with communication is just being open with employees and letting them know that you haven't made a decision yet. And here are the things that you're considering. Here's what you're looking at. You know, what would they like to suggest? What would they like to add or include into the decision making? A couple of other things that are happening, best practices, those companies that have made that decision to either be fully remote or hybrid are going back from a practical standpoint and looking at their job descriptions for their employees, and are they really developed around outcomes and deliverables? Or are they based around that I see you every day in the office, and so that's how I know that you're working? So putting those kinds of things in place with their job descriptions is a key piece. And the other piece that's been touched on is technology. Really making sure that if people are working remotely, that they've got the technology to do that, and the technology to communicate with the office. And again, that communication piece, what are those schedules? Who's working remotely on what hours? And making sure that all of that's clear. But really kind of coming back to the basics. And, you know, as Marlene mentioned, and actually Jill mentioned as well, what can we do within our organization? What's going to work for us, and how can we make that work?
Do you see a shift towards workplaces preferring project-based work styles? This has come up a bit in my own reporting on this subject, versus what I think that you were suggesting, perhaps the requirement that you be, you know, in your seat from 9 to 5 in front of your computer every day.
I think it really depends upon the industry and the organization. This is a huge change. I mean, you know, I'm sure everybody else on the call, the other panelists, you know, Jill, you guys maybe were further ahead than most of us in thinking about it back in 2019, but most organizations had thought about hybrid, had thought about some remote, but a lot of organizations hadn't gone down that path and thought they had years to kind of make that decision, or that they could do it in one-offs. Now, after COVID, with it being, you know, something that's really out there on a more regular basis, we're caught a little bit behind the 8 ball, that our roles, our responsibilities, those job descriptions, those expectations just haven't caught up yet. And so, you know, I think there are some people that are moving to but that's a big shift for a lot of organizations. So I think it's really more looking at those job descriptions and how can I redefine it? So what do I really need you to produce? You know, Monica, with your job, how many interviews do I need you? How many pieces do I need you to be putting out on what kind of a basis versus, you know, laying out what those tasks and responsibilities are?
Absolutely. And so turning to Marlene and Jill then, how did you go about developing your new policies and procedures via surveys, perhaps? I've seen a lot of various takes on the return to work surveys on LinkedIn in the last several weeks. And do you have any tips on how to effectively implement and communicate these changes with your workforce?
I'll go. So some of the things that we did, I think I mentioned earlier that HR did establish a remote work committee to evaluate the impact on the campus of remote and hybrid work. We conducted a remote work employee survey to determine employees' thoughts and feelings about returning to work. We developed and implemented a remote work policy, which it is each employee has to complete along with their manager. They have to complete their schedule and their work agreement and how they're going to stay productive. You know, what is the expectation that they're going to accomplish each week? HR designed and delivered a mandatory learning class for managers who are participating in the hybrid or 100% remote, how to manage remote workers. And we're going to be sending out pulse surveys over the next few months as well to see how things are going and what is the impact on our customers and as well as on employee engagement. I think that is the challenge. How do you keep the employee experience the same across the board? So we'll continue to, monitor and get feedback from our employees on an ongoing basis.
So here at Fallon, it was very similar to the process that Marlene describes at UMass. We, along with the firm that we partnered with, we've had a cross-functional team that's been working on this all along. And it includes partners in information technology, corporate relations, operations, just so that we get a full perspective. In terms of some of the policies and procedures, I mean, there's just so many, right? I mean, is it relating to how you can work from your home office most successfully? Is it the safety procedures in the building? There's just been so much policy development. I try to always spin this from human resources perspective that this is exciting and interesting, right? This seismic shift versus, scary, right? Because we are going at such a fast clip in terms of change. And so just to also mention Chelsea, right? Our legal partners have been really important during this time. And you learn sort of what the expectations are in terms of regulations and guidance, and then you have to figure out what's best for your culture. And then in terms of communicating them, you just keep communicating in all different types of channels. And especially with this type of topic, like remote work, there's some biases that creep in, that's been mentioned. So that's, again, getting back out in front of employees, bringing people back together, reiterating the message, and just keep on saying it.
Yes, speaking of Chelsea, I'm turning to you next. Thank you for your patience. We have, my first question for you is sort of an overarching question, so please forgive the vagueness, but what, if any, are the legal considerations employers should keep in mind when developing these kinds of new policies and procedures?
Yeah, such a great question. As you mentioned, I could do a whole presentation on it. I'll start with 3 things. I think the first step has already been mentioned. A lot of things that have already been mentioned are actually legal as well as cultural or moral aspects as well. So it all goes hand in hand. So the first step, as Meredith described, is a challenge, and as Jill and Marlene have said that they're already implementing and considering. The first step is for an employer to figure out who is coming back, who needs to be in the workplace and why. That's important for several reasons. It's important because when you're communicating with employees, they're going to ask why do I have to be here and this other employee doesn't? You've already thought about it. You're providing a consistent answer. That's important. Employees don't like inconsistency. The law doesn't like inconsistency. And that's where bias can creep in as well. So we want to have that consistent explanation. It also helps when you're drafting your policies because you know who's going to come back, who's not. And it also helps when you're responding to requests for accommodation. You've already kind of thought about the rationale and which positions can be performed remotely and which cannot. That's not at the exclusion of the individualized assessment that you have to perform when an employee does make a request for a reasonable accommodation, but it is good to start thinking about it beforehand so that you're better prepared to respond to requests that you do receive. So that's the first point. I think the second point that is really important and very overarching is to draft your policies with the flexibility to allow you to act. I see a lot of policies where employers are making promises. I don't really like that. Like, we are going to do this all the time. Well, you're not, because you're a business and you're and you have your, different employees and they're individuals, and you won't always be able to respond in the same way. And so that is really, it's a fine line, I understand, between being vague and providing employees with the information that they need, but also not giving them expectations that won't be met. So just saying, we'll strive to do this, and not making any long-term promises, making it clear that this is the policy that we have in place now, but that it might change. It might change as we get feedback from employees. It might change as the pandemic changes. There's just so many different things that can go into it. So that's okay to say. Your policy doesn't have to be promises, and it doesn't have to be long-term and permanent. So those are just some high-level things that I see employers kind of struggling with. And then there are, when we're talking about content of policies, there are several things that employers should include when we're talking about remote work policies in order to avoid some legal issues. So the first is, when you have remote workers, it's tough to monitor, whether they're working, when they're working, to avoid a wage and hour violation. To the extent that's possible, you want to include clear expectations for the employee regarding this is when you can work. If you work outside of these hours, we need to know about it, potentially putting in place a reporting mechanism or timekeeping mechanism, so that way we are paying them for all the time that they're working. Speaking specifically about non-exempt employees, because those are the ones who are entitled to overtime. And if we knew or should have known that they were working overtime, we're going to have to pay that. And so that's why we need to really require employees to report all of their hours and have provisions in place for discipline if they keep working, or if they do work right outside of the hours that they're supposed to. Also including, which has been touched upon, data security concerns. So including things like Jill has said about potentially considering restrictions on employees printing at home if you have, or not printing certain documents at home that are potentially confidential or sensitive. So that's something to include in the policy. Should also address workplace injuries. Know that the remote environment is in many ways an expansion of the in-office environment, in that you could, and employers will, I'm sure some will, be liable for workplace injuries that occur at home in the remote work environment. And employees need to know about that so that they do report them. So make sure you include, the requirement that employees report these injuries to you so you know about them. Also, another thing I see coming up very frequently is that employees, or at least more frequently than we've ever seen it before, is employees who have been remote for a while are now like, okay, well, I can work from anywhere. And they are, and some of them are moving. And that's something that a lot of employers haven't really thought about, whether they can operate in different states, whether they have the workers' compensation insurance to operate in different states. So it's really important that if there are limitations on where employees can work, you include that. And you also include a requirement that they inform you. Potentially if they're traveling, you might want to include that for safety reasons, health and safety of your workplace, but also if they're moving or working someplace for an extended period of time. And then also, as Meredith said, I think that privacy is really important and something to address in your policies. And so she had mentioned, can you tell other employees about vaccination status? This is coming up. And I think no, you can't disclose that information. And it's important to have that, but employers question it all the time, like, well, what do I do? Because you want to give this employee assurance. That's completely reasonable. I think one way to do that is to have a strong policy in place of like, here's our health and safety procedures. And so you tell the employee, look, I'm protecting their medical information just as I protect yours. You know, I unfortunately can't disclose it, but I can tell you what we're doing to keep the workplace safe. And then you have those policies in place. So any other questions?
Yeah, I have a follow-up.
Yeah.
Are there any liability concerns for perhaps, say, this is completely hypothetical, if an employee feels like their employer hasn't set up a safe working environment to deal with COVID in particular, do they have any, like, should employers be concerned about that?
Yes, absolutely. So OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Act, has a requirement in it that employers comply with what's called the General Duty Clause, which means that you need to take reasonable efforts to protect your workplace from harm, harm and injury. And so employers do need to comply with that standard. And that's a general standard. That's not COVID specific. OSHA has guidance that's out right now. It's about, and it speaks about, so employers should definitely take a look at that. I actually did a whole presentation on it, so again, I'll try to be brief. But employers should take a look at that. There's specific guidance for healthcare industries as well, so be aware of that. And also be aware of the fact that OSHA has established this guidance of how to comply with the General Duty Clause, and they treated vaccinated and unvaccinated employees differently for most workplaces, excluding the healthcare sector and other high risk sectors. And that might change now that the CDC has said that vaccinated employees need to wear masks in high risk areas. So it's important to review the OSHA guidance, but then consider as well the new impact on the CDC's most recent update, because that hasn't been reflected in the guidance yet.
Got it. That's very interesting. I have definitely spoken with, I think actually HR professionals with clients who have had that issue where they've separated people, and then the question becomes, well, are we treating our employees equally? What do you do?
Yeah, exactly. So I'd say you certainly can generally, it's okay to put in place a vaccination requirement, and you can terminate employees for not complying with that. And I don't really think that's unequal treatment per se, because you're establishing the same requirement for all your workforce. And then if you don't comply, then they're subject to termination. And that is, of course, subject to reasonable accommodations for religious reasons or disability related reasons. But generally, you can have that requirement. I think when the issue of unequal treatment comes up is when you decide maybe I'll require it or I'll encourage it, but I'm going to have unvaccinated and vaccinated employees in the same workspace or remote. The unvaccinated employees will be remote, vaccinated employees will be in person. I think the risk that you run there with the unequal treatment, and it doesn't prohibit you from doing any of this per se, but it's just something to consider, is potentially disclosing and indirectly disclosing medical information about your employees. Because if you say unvaccinated employees vaccinated employees do not need to social distance and unvaccinated employees do, and then you're treating those two right? So you're treating employees differently. Someone could probably figure out by the fact that one person's required to sit way over there that they're probably unvaccinated. So just need to be mindful when you're crafting your policies about not just the messaging not just what you're disclosing directly, but also the messaging you're sending to your employees when you do treat vaccinated and unvaccinated employees differently, and whether there's ways that you can mitigate the risk of disclosing indirectly sensitive medical information.
That's a great point. To shift the conversation back towards the physical workplace, I have a question for Meredith, which is, what do you see as the top benefits, but also the drawbacks of a hybrid model?
Well, I think the benefits are clear, and we've all talked about them this morning. Employee relations and that work-life balance for employees, that they really enjoy working from home or working remotely. So you've got that piece for your employee relations and recruitment and retention. There have been studies that have shown that anywhere from 25, excuse me, to 60% of employees are going to be leaving their employer because they won't allow a hybrid or remote workplace. I'm not sure that that's totally true in our area because of some of the industries that we have, but there are a number of people that really want that. So I think that employee relations piece and recruitment and retention is a great benefit that's going to be there. I think the drawback are some of the things that we've all talked about. One is technology, really making sure that you've got the technology in place, whether it be around security. We talked about not printing at home, but who's going to use my work computer? If I have a work computer at home, am I the only one that can use it? Am I the only one that can access it? Can somebody access it and get to some other information? Is my bandwidth, is my internet, is what I have at home strong enough to do what I need to be doing? If I need to be on the phone and on Zoom calls with everybody all day, can I do that without any problems? So I think technology can be a huge drawback. And I think the other piece, again, is just the whole communication piece and the individuality. I hate to harp on something, but growing up in HR, it was one size fits all, everybody's policy. You set up one policy for everybody. And now it is very individual. And you have to be prepared to talk about that. And to what Chelsea talked about, you have to be prepared to back it up. So do you have the documentation on job performance that you can show that I don't work well from home? I'm not producing, I'm not delivering what I need to be. So you need to pull back that offer of allowing me to work from home while you're keeping it from other people, or keeping that in place for other people. So do you have that documentation? Do you have that backup to justify what you're doing? And I think the other major drawback is the whole culture piece. It does really shift your culture and shifts how you're going to work with all of your employees. So it is a huge benefit. And I think it's something that we all need to cope with. The culture, the communication are things that we can overcome, but it's going to take some real work. And I think our HR teams are stretched and stressed, but it's going to continue for a while for them to do that.
Now, something that you said actually leads perfectly into my next question for Jill. Fallon currently has a hybrid model in place for most of its office employees, as I think you've said. But you've previously said that the company, like others, is struggling with staff leaving for fully remote positions as the market that they're able to work for has now expanded. How are you staying competitive and retaining employees in the face of this very new challenge?
Right. So the challenge specifically that I had shared with the group before was related to, now that companies across the country are offering fully remote options, employees that were more limited or had their options limited because of geography don't have that limitation necessarily anymore. So if you had, say, we had someone with a very technical skill set, that tends to be needed at larger organizations, that person lived in the western part of the state. Well, what large organizations are they going to look at in terms of employment? Well, they're going to look at places where there's a reasonable commute. So if you're in Ware or Palmer, you're probably not going to go to the 128 belt or into Cambridge. So you'd come here, you'd come to Fallon Health and you'd love it, right? Well, now we just had somebody go to Microsoft because they don't have to go in every day. It's just these different requirements, are increasing the competition. So one of the things that we're doing at the same time by making sure everybody's safe and, we're in compliance with, COVID and OSHA and safety regulations is really developing our national talent strategy, because we're now competing with organizations that we never had to compete with before. And we have to do that at a really fast pace. And then also we want to take advantage of it. So if we have hard to fill positions, we want to hire from other states, but then we have to make sure, like what Chelsea said, that we have the right coverage from a workers' comp perspective, that we're following their leave laws, right? Depending on how many employees we have in that state. So there's just a tremendous amount of work and it needs to be done really quickly because again, the change is happening so fast.
Got it. And Was someone going to pop in? Oh, no, my apologies. So for Marlene and Jill, then, I think we've talked about this a little bit, but I wanted to ask you specifically, what are some of the largest challenges of managing the hybrid remote workforce, and what are some of the best practices you've developed, whether that's, as we've alluded to before, communicating with employees throughout the workday, making sure that they're fulfilling their job duties, that they're available during working hours, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think some of the challenges are, again, are we keeping employees engaged? Is the employee experience the same across the board? Obviously, people who are totally remote or starting a new job totally remote, I think is challenging, because you kind of miss the dynamics that happen when you're in person, right? So how do we keep these employees that we have recruited? We have recruited some top talent, but we want to make sure we retain them and that they have that level of engagement, that they're not going to leave us in 6 months or a year or so. So we have, we have developed, like I said, some training programs, some other resources that may be available to folks about best practices on how to manage a remote or hybrid workforce. And, I think because of the talent shortage out there, or the competition out there, it's our responsibility, managers' responsibility to, implement some of those strategies in order to keep people engaged and to retain them. What Jill was saying earlier, I mean, we have, like, our competition has always been some of the, Boston, Cambridge, organizations who pay a lot more money, right? Boston salaries. But, we still find that people still want to, they believe in the mission of the medical school. So they want to stay there. We need to be flexible with those employees to retain them. And we've been successful in many cases, so.
Sure. So just coming off of what Marlene just said, keeping our employees connected to our mission, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which also for us is a connection to the community, has been important through managing this entire, sort of, if you want to call it, event or transformation. So really connecting with our employees on a very regular basis. So this isn't just hard on HR, it's also hard on our leaders. We're expecting a lot from them. They're transitioning how they're used to managing. They need to make sure their employees are okay more than they might have had to do before. They need to be aware of what challenges they're facing and then work through them. I was in a meeting yesterday, right? Because we're all trying to make sure our companies are successful. That's like, our companies are successful and our employees are safe. To be successful, we need to keep the right talent. And sometimes we run into issues, right? Like a department performance is starting to wane. Our first inclination was, we'll bring it back, right? But what we're saying is, can you work through it from a remote perspective first? Like, can you partner with IT? Is there some type of solution, a new solution that can be put in place versus what we're most comfortable with and what we're most used to? Because part of what we're also saying is, if your solution is bringing them back, some may fall out, right? You may lose some talent because they can go somewhere else. And then it's going to be harder for us to backfill it if you're requiring this on-site presence that maybe other organizations are not. So there's constant management required, connections with the employees, the leaders, the whole group of us.
Yeah.
So this, I think, also naturally leads into the next question that I have, which is for all of you. So please feel free to pipe in. But the situation has changed dramatically, even from when we started to put this panel together. So in light of the recently revised CDC guidance, which Chelsea mentioned just a few minutes ago, for vaccinated people, what, if any, conversations are you currently having or plans are you planning on implementing in case we have another surge or further change in government guidelines?
Well, I think that's going to be a fluid process. You know, I have to say one of the advantages of working at the medical school is that we have some great infectious disease physicians, faculty who, you know, stay on top of all the new CDC guidelines and so forth and so on. So I just think it's going to be a fluid process right along until, you know, we get, you know, maybe more towards the fall, you know, we'll see. But one of the things that, you know, the medical school does as well is, you know, we have virtual town hall meetings on a monthly basis, and our infectious disease specialists do give updates at those. And, you know, they also help us with you know, travel policies, the vaccinations, the rate of COVID in Massachusetts, and so forth and so on. So they're always working with HR and senior leadership to make sure that we are up to date on all the changes that are taking place. But that's where we're at right now. So we'll see.
I think I've said this a few times, similar to Marlene, we also have on staff some pretty knowledgeable doctors, and they've collaborated with us along the way. So we are going to reinstitute weekly meetings with what we call a clinical work stream, which is part of our overall cross-functional planning committee. And we're just going to keep an eye on it. I will say yesterday I was in one meeting feeling really behind on some of the return to the office under the hybrid model work, right? Like I wanted more people back or, you know, ready to be back. And then you turn on the news and you're like, oh, maybe it's good that this is happening a little more slowly, right? You know, you get new signs up, right? And they look great. And I'm like, oh, wow, okay, so Worcester's yellow. Does that mean that those signs come down and the old ones go back up? You know, it's just, evolution is the right description too. We just constantly changing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's what we're hearing from our members in the companies we're dealing with, is just really trying to keep an eye on it and trying to manage, again, employee expectations. That, you know, as we've all said, you turn on the national news and you hear that everything's horrible and the rates are going up tremendously and we're going back into this. But then you look at the local statistics here in Massachusetts, and you know, we're in our own little enclave. We've done a great job. Our constituents, our, you know, citizens have done a great job in getting vaccinated and not having that spread. So it's kind of managing, again, that communication, but staying aware of things. I don't think any of our companies really want to go back to requiring masks, but they're realizing that that may be a possibility. But, you know, we wish we had the resources that Jill and Marlene have to have that infectious disease person to update us regularly on what's going on.
And if I could, from a legal perspective, I alluded to this a little bit earlier, but just more specifically, so if employers are allowing, they're following the OSHA guidance, which had said that non-healthcare, you know, non-high-risk settings, these employers could allow unvaccinated employees to go unmasked in common spaces if they were all unvaccinated within a portion of the workforce. So if you have like a segregated portion of the workforce that's all unvaccinated employees, you can allow them to go maskless. If you are doing that, I think that the CDC's new guidance maybe requires you to reassess that, and especially so if you are in a high-risk area. And I believe, I looked into it yesterday, so it might have changed, but I believe there are 5 counties in Massachusetts that would fall in that category, where the CDC would say, you know, you should be wearing a mask in public spaces. And so especially for employers in those counties, look at the risk of your county, look it up online, but you should reassess whether your safety protocols are adequate to meet OSHA's general duty clause.
So a follow-up to this question then, maybe directed at Meredith, but again, also open to everybody, is with your members, did they do anything when the pandemic first really hit or during the second surge that you think that they've learned from, that they would maybe not do again insofar as personnel policies?
That's a great question. I think one of the things that they've learned that they would not do again is, again, kind of set that broad and general policy that just says everybody has to do this. That they really are realizing that everything has to be individual based upon the person and then the job and the need of the company. But I think a lot of them are looking at things that they would continue to do versus not do. And one, we've harped on it a lot, but is communication, is just talking with employees all the time and trying to share as much information as they can. I think a lot of employers have tried to kind of walk that fine line on, you get a lot of information about COVID and the variants and everything from the national news or from wherever your news setting is, and employers have tried to stay out of that conversation. And I think what they found is that they need to be kind of that middle voice sometimes. And, not that you're trying to sway anybody to believe something, but that you're saying, this is the CDC, this is the Massachusetts Department of Health, this is this is what the Massachusetts people are saying, this is where things are coming from, and trying to be that middle line as far as communication around this whole situation.
Did anyone else want to weigh in with any lessons learned from the last two surges? If not, that's okay. So we're getting towards wrapping up. So I have a couple more questions. I'm going to jump to Meredith again, sorry, to go right back to you and ask you, what have been some of the deciding criteria for employers when deciding whether or not to enforce vaccines? Are we talking employee safety, customer safety, a combination perhaps? And please, Jill and Marlene, feel free to weigh in as well in particular.
I think all of the above. I think really up until this point, as the vaccines became available, it really was more a point of employee relations and recruitment and retention. We don't want to require the vaccine, in the beginning, because there were some people that weren't eligible for it. And so how can I require it if you're not eligible for it yet? So a major piece in that decision was employee relations. I don't want to lose people. I'm hoping that everybody's going to do it voluntarily when they're eligible for it. I think now it's getting more towards that employee safety and customer expectations. In talking about workforces coming back to work, and Chelsea's talked a lot about it, is that general duty clause. And, how do I reassure employees that they're working around people that have been vaccinated? So I think employers are looking more at, maybe I should be requiring this. Maybe, we're going to have to put this in place because of the Delta variant and the increase in cases and things that are there, and looking at it from that employee safety perspective. We're not seeing quite as much yet within some of our members around the customers, but I think that that's going to come. I look at our industry, and we do have some of our members where we're going on site, and they say, are your people vaccinated? Have they been vaccinated? Before you can come on site, we need you to be vaccinated. So those, I think, are the three main things, but it's employee relations, that recruitment and retention. Can I afford to lose those people if they aren't vaccinated? And then employee safety and customer safety.
Sure. So Monica, I'll just take a minute. I think it's going to be easier to require vaccinations in clinical spaces first, right? So a lot of what we've been doing is we're watching to see what others are doing. When you're the leader of the pack, right, and others aren't doing it, your employees are much more likely to be like, what? I don't think you could do this. If you're sort of following, right, which is a little bit easier, and they're seeing a lot of other organizations do it, they're not going to question it as much, right? So for us, there's been a lot of watching to see what other organizations are doing. And then in the clinical space, we're about 90% vaccinated. So we're also watching the vaccination rate to know if we would even need to do that. If you're at 90%, do you really need to, require the other 10%? Especially because most of them, we've had conversations and we understand their reasoning, and we're not going to force it. Now that said, if things get really, really dangerous again, particularly for those employees with the boots on the ground, which I saw in the chat, we all always want to be thanking them. Maybe we'll change our stance on it.
Understood. That makes a lot of sense. Chelsea, I have the last big question is directed towards you to sort of bring this conversation full circle. Do employees have any legal rights when it comes to not wanting to return to the office at this point? I think we alluded to that a bit with the liability and safety issue earlier. And then in turn, do employers, and is there a difference between a large employer and a small employer in this realm?
Yeah, so for your first question, it depends on why the employee doesn't want to come back. So if it's just because they don't want to, or they have a moral objection to coming back, then generally no, they're going to need to come back. But there are legally required accommodations for religious and disability related reasons. So those are available and those are legal protections. So again, it's going to depend on why. The general duty clause is more, that's not going to really dictate. I mean, you can make an assessment of whether or not you should bring people back, and maybe you should definitely assess whether it's unsafe to do so. But you certainly can do that, and people can't say, no, it's the general duty clause, I'm not coming back, because you can say, well, we've put in place protections to comply with it with you here. So so that is less of a consideration. But important to remember that there are those reasonable accommodations available. Regarding whether it's different for a small versus large company, whether there should be different rules, I think the real difference might be perhaps in factors contributing to whether a particular accommodation poses an undue hardship. So it's possible that small employers might have less capacity in their workforce to budget to provide certain accommodations for people who request reasonable accommodations. That's one of the areas where I do see a bit of a difference, but overall, the small employers are still required to comply. They're still required to grant these accommodations. And so I do see that being very similar for small and larger employers.
Understood. Well, I think this was a great conversation. Thank you, all of you. Thank you, Jill, Meredith, and Chelsea for your participation and your insight. And again, a special thanks to Bowditch and Dewey for their sponsorship of today's webcast. As mentioned previously, everyone will receive an email with a link to today's webcast recording. And thanks again, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.